I can give just a. Yeah.
All right. So using my screen and my pointer, I'm assuming. Yeah. All good. I'll be, so if it is if I don't look like I'm looking at yours because I have the screen on the other screen. So yeah, I'll be kind of checking my own stuff. Apologies for that. All right, so shall we get started then? All right, so welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for attending today to this talk. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to the organizers. It's kind of an honor to be here today. I've been following the program and the workshops and talks, the series of talks so far, and I've enjoyed them a lot. So I was kind of surprised and honored when I was invited to be part of it. So thank you very much. Let me first introduce myself before we start to talk about neaten up your code. So my name is Alfredo Sanchez Tojar. So I'm a junior principal investigator here in Bielefeld University in Germany. I'm an evolutionary ecologist, a non-ornithologist by training, given that I've been birding for a few years. I'm not very good birder, but I've been doing it for a few years. And I did my bachelor thesis, my master thesis, my PhD thesis, all with birds. And it is this tiny little bird here on the corner, this house parrot, that kind of made me sort of almost reconvert into an evidence synthesist. So these days, most of what I do is evidence synthesis work, so systematic reviews, but mostly meta-analysis. But I also started to get interested into meta-research, which I'm enjoying it a lot, and I'm kind of moving perhaps more and more towards it. So what I'm not is I'm not a programmer. So I do programming because I had to learn at the beginning of my PhD, a little bit before perhaps. So I'm not an expert. I've been self-taught for quite a few years. And I'm certainly not an expert on neat code, even though I work towards producing neater and neater code. So that's what I do because since the very beginning of my PhD, I realized I wanted to kind of share my code with other people. And for that, I realized that I wanted to produce neater code. I don't know if it was the social pressure or the peer pressure of not having bad code, but I really tried to make a little bit of a push on getting at having more readable code so that I can more easily or feel better about providing it to other people. So I divided the talk into 3 parts. Part 1, I called it the problem, which is probably not new for most of you, but I thought it was good anyway that we go through the problem, whatever that is. Part 2 is the briefing, so just recapitulating some of the things that were already shared in the previous session about how to write a little bit more or neater code. So just focusing on a few things that you may want to focus on today when you are neatening up your code. And then I will just show a little bit of a bad example from my first PhD project, just for the fun of making fun of myself. Okay, so part 1, the problem. I mean, the reasons why to neaten up code, first of all, for yourself, just think about coming back to your code and not having to spend hours trying to understand it. So I don't know, whenever you have to implement changes to your code after peer review, or if you have like fieldwork interruptions, or whenever you start having multiple projects in parallel, every time you come back to a project and you have to open the code, it is always like a big step to do it and really try to understand what you did. So the easier, the neater the code, the easier that is going to be, and the less scary. But also for others. And for others, you can think of members of the lab, for example. There might be people coming after you to the lab, whatever lab you are in, and you want to help with continuity so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel and we all become a little bit more efficient with the resources we are given, which are sometimes pretty scarce. Or even external researchers, so other people's. And this is more like under the umbrella of open science to try to make the materials of our work available, and so that we increase computational reproducibility and etc. And this is what I wanted to focus on the problem, just a tiny little bit on reproducibility. First of all, what is reproducibility? Reproducibility is sometimes used to refer to replicability, but I really like to make the difference. So reproducibility for me is like you use the same data, the same analysis to produce the same results that somebody else has produced, or even yourselves a few months ago. Whereas replicability is collecting new data to try to reach the same results. That's how I like to differentiate them. So this kind of same data, same analysis sounds sometimes for some people like, how is this a question? But it is a question because reproducibility is actually harder than we think. So there are a few papers on different fields. In ecology, there are at least two recent ones looking at the computational reproducibility of research. And for example, from this recent paper, the first thing you find is that not all what is published can be tested for computational reproducibility, mostly because of a lack of data, but also because of a lack of information. So from the around 20% that they could test in this study, they decided at the end, they concluded that about 68% would be somewhat reproducible after they got the data and tried to reproduce their results. In other fields, such as social learning, with a wider range of years of publication from 1955 to 2018, they've tried to do the same, with perhaps a little bit of a much larger effort. Again, you cannot always test the reproducibility of research, mostly because of data availability. And when you can, it does not reach 100%. So again, from 40 papers that they tried to reproduce the results from in this case, so they selected randomly 40 papers, they concluded that 81% were somewhat reproducible. And by reproducible, we don't mean like getting exactly the same numbers. It might be like slightly different numbers, but at least reaching the same conclusions. So reproducibility is not that easy. And in other fields, it seems to range normally between somewhat around 20 and 80%. Again, reproducibility. Why is it that difficult? So data availability seems to be an issue with the published studies. So it seems to be clear that if you don't upload your data to a long-term repository, data availability is going to decrease with time after you publish your paper. This is because you've probably changed houses, laptop, hard drives got stolen or broken. This has been shown a couple of times in ecology and evolution and in other fields. This is a pretty common thing. So this would be a good reason why to put your data in a long-term repository. You probably increase the life expectancy of your data. Data reusability is also an issue. So not all the data, even when provided by the authors, can be understood, and not even with their help. So there can be missing information, or data can be simply incomplete. So this is a survey from papers providing open data from 2012 and 2013. And they concluded that around 56% of the data sets were somewhat incomplete, so they could not be used for reproducibility. And this figure hasn't changed after they've done a larger survey from papers published between 2013 and 2019, which is surprising. That is still actually 56%. As maybe this is a typo, but I really think it was the same number. But code availability can also be an issue. So from a survey we did recently, papers published between 2015 and 2019, for journals that had actually code sharing policies, we found that data sharing was pretty high, so around 80%. That doesn't mean they are complete, but there was data. But code sharing was pretty low, 27%, that's despite these policies. And I mean, you may think that you do not need the code to reproduce the results of a paper that is published, but because you might rely on the information that the authors provide in the materials and methods. And I would say yes, but there will be cases where it is impossible to know what the authors did. And I mean, as a data and code editor for now Ecology Letters, but I've done it a couple of times. And generally as a reviewer that tries to look at the code and the data when provided, it always helps me to have the code to understand the materials and methods, because I think it's actually pretty difficult to write statistical analysis in a written form that is understandable for everybody. And also, there is a lot of data cleaning and processing that you could not share in the materials and methods of a paper, and that are key, and normally potentially the places where the source of errors are come from. So yeah, I would argue that code availability would help a lot. And if you ask people about what are the reasons for the lack of reproducibility for people that have tried to reproduce some results, they normally, or they seem to be strong about the fact that having a workflow that is poorly documented, or the code that is poorly documented, can be big factors in their lack of reproducibility, or in their not success of reproducing these results, or sometimes that the code is too complex. And this is also something that we can try to work with for neatening up our code, to make it a bit, despite some code being complex, make it a little bit less complex or more readable and understandable. So part 2, that will be the briefing. So this is really just recapitulating some of the things that were talked about in detail in the previous list of talks from this initiative. I really recommend rewatching, if you haven't, or even if you have watched this talk, rewatching it. I've done it a couple of times and it's pretty useful. It's really well done. And there were lots of tips that were very good, and some of them I never heard of. So I really recommend it. And also there are a lot of resources provided there, so that you can really aim at little by little, and without overwhelming yourself, try to get better at producing neater code. So I'm gonna just recapitulate some of the things that were provided there, so that we have them fresh for today's mini workshop. First of all, and I fully endorse and agree with this, is to be consistent. Consistency in choose your coding style, whatever that is. Whether that is Google's R style guide, Tidyverse style guide, something I've learned recently about, really, or whatever you like, but just keep it. You may not need to keep it from project to project, because you may want to still search for that utopic end of super neat code. So you may want to implement little changes from one project to another in an attempt to improve, but at least within the project, I would recommend that you are consistent in your code. So keep it. So whether you use upper camel case or snake case or lower camel case or whatever case you want to use, just try to keep it throughout your script, because that's going to really help anybody reading it, including yourself. So regarding this upper camel case or snake case, so there seems to be conference proceedings papers saying that camel case is more readable, helps with readability. I've asked on Twitter recently actually about it, because we were deciding within the lab how to use these things to make our life more easy and to be a little bit consistent within the lab. And it seems that from the people that voted in my Twitter poll, most of them use snake case, but some people actually said that they prefer to use snake case for like objects, when you're defining objects that should normally you should normally use names for these objects, such as, I don't know, a database or a vector. And they seem to prefer camel case for like functions. And this might be something you want to keep throughout your script. That might help you easily identify where the functions are if you have decided to put them somewhere that is not at the top, which might be recommended, or in a separate script that you source in your code. But whatever you do, really, I really endorse this consistency. It makes things easier. Consistent naming, I found it really important for myself. So for naming the files, the folders, the scripts, the names of the objects. So within the lab, which kind of started with the lab recently, we had quite a bit of talk about how to make things more readable for ourselves, because we are going to be collaborating with each other quite a lot. And we kind of ended up with this potential folder structure that we want to use in our R projects. Some of the folders might not be necessary for you or for other projects, but I think the code, data, figures, and manuscript will be a pretty standard one that we may all want to use in our papers, because we all will be using code, data for sure. We'll probably provide some figures in any paper we write, or most of them, and we will have a manuscript. So this might be things that we could all keep with the same name. That would make it very easy, actually, if we will all agree on this somehow. And then you can have other folders for other things that may go into it, like protocols, promotion, if you want to promote your paper on Twitter and you want to have a folder where you write your tweets, or tables if you make them tables as figures, which I learned that might not be a good idea, even though I thought it was a very cool and neat thing. And for naming, I like using numbers to refer to the order in which the scripts should be used. And I have certain names that I use from project to project. So every time I do an evidence synthesis project, so I often have always a script that is the first one, that is title and abstract screening, and the second that is the full text screening. And this code it's actually code that I mostly reuse from project to project, which basically imports data from references, cleans it and prepare it for the screening and so on. And I like to have also one for supporting information. Shall you provide supporting information? Or even an R markdown for the supporting information. But I think this numbering, at least for me, it helps, because then I know what to use. And I can write an easy README telling anybody to kind of go in order one by one. But I guess this is a matter of finding your style and using it. I recommend using self-explanatory names. This potential drawback on this is that sometimes names can become too long. So I think it's good that you have some kind of acronyms that you use consistently, so that you know what they mean, and maybe you can put that at the beginning of the code. But otherwise, self-explanatory names help a lot. So for example, here, I'm importing data from Web of Science for a project. So this is bibliographic information, and I call the database WOS, which is Web of Science. The same because I've used two search engines. Scopus was the other one, so I call it Scopus. And I keep that so that I know where the data comes from. And then I had to, both of the data sets, I had to reduce the number of columns, the variables, because I was importing it into another software. And I like to use, in my coding, I always use this red to refer to reduced. It's something that I started using at some point, and I keep it from project to project. As you can see, I'm not sure what case I'm using here. It's not snake case, so I use a dot. At some point, somebody said it was good, and I started using it. And yeah, I don't know actually if this has a name and if it actually is good or bad. So maybe don't copy it. All right, for readability, I recommend spacing and indentation. It helps a lot for me. So I'm really picky with this stuff. I struggle reading things that are not very well ordered. So I really need it for myself. And with time, I got better into it, and I chose a pattern that I like myself. So I use hashtags to define sections, and I like to use 2 lines of hashtags. Some people use 1. I like to use 2 to spot them very quickly and to have the sections well written, like easily identifiable through my script. I've started using this margin that you can add in RStudio. Somewhere I read that the recommendation is that you use an 80, I think it's characters, to really try to keep your code there, and that helps with readability, and for me it does. So I like to use that, which you can set up by doing this, really just code. And I know that's another trick. You can set it up here. In the general options, you can go to code, display, and you can choose the margin to be set. So that's a pretty neat thing to really keep always in a justify sort of text. It helps for me because it feels like a manuscript somehow. Also, I normally always stick to using 1 enter or 2 if I want to really separate blocks of code. So that's what I normally do. one enter, or two if there is a lot of code and I need more separation. So this would be like modifying variable type, because I'm doing the same here. It's just making two variables as factors. I don't need an enter, but after that, when I'm going through the next step that I want to do, whatever that is, in this case is renaming, I think, or yeah, recategorizing, then I have another set of code and an enter in between, and that helps me. But again, you may choose differently, and visually you may have different options. The good thing of using these hashtags also is that in RStudio, you can click there and it kind of folds everything inside. So if you don't want to see all the code, you may have a long script. You can just click on this buttons that show up when you put, so you can see it here, and then everything folds, and you just see the next section, the code of the next section, which sometimes I've used when visually going through my code. So I think it's pretty handy because it kind of feels like you have sections in a manuscript. Something that I do constantly, I do Control-A, Control-I, because that indents the lines and it sorts everything very well, even if you've changed names and things in your code. So this is a trick that I do like per default, like many people do Control-S constantly, me included. I do Control-A, Control-I for all my code. I don't know if it is good, but it always sorts everything whenever I mess things around, and the indentation gets very good. And the last point to recapitulate is commenting. In the past, I've had people that say that you should not comment code, saying that basically by commenting, you kind of make people think, you don't make people think about what you're doing, so it's more difficult for them to pick up on errors. But I kind of disagree with that, and I think many people recommend these days that you comment your code. Normally, they recommend that you explain the why of the code that is coming by using these hashtags at the beginning before the code is written. I also like to put the what the code is doing at times, at least when you are using code that is not self-explanatory or is maybe not the standard coding or a little bit complicated. I like to explain what it does so that if you are reading the code of somebody else and you never encountered that type of coding, at least you don't need to spend a lot of time Googling what actually the code is doing. Then the author is telling you, and you can try to figure it out by using that information. So a lot of whys and a little bit of what would be my perfect balance when you're explaining or commenting your code. So this was the bonus trick that I shared with the margins. And another one that I learned recently is that with functions, you can just go to code, insert oxygen skeleton, and that generates on top of the function a little piece of code with the variables that you should be naming for your function. So the input, the output, what the function does, and so on. And I think it's a very easy way of kind of standardizing how you explain and provide the sort of metadata for your functions. I've only used it a couple of times now, but it's really like, wow. It's a good reminder to always keep the same structure because it's just one click and it's there. Part 3, and I'm going a little bit over time, apologies for that, is just a little bit of an example from my first PhD project, which was a small project that we published in Journal of Avian Biology. We just wanted to know if these little spookies, if they kind of hold a territory over the years. By territory, I mean a nest box, and if they move around differently with age. And this is what we found. So nothing tremendous, but there was a lot of programming in this project. Actually, I learned a lot because I had to use this RFID data, which is like sort of tracking data, and I never programmed much before this, so I had to learn quite a lot of the programming by going through thousands and thousands of readings. So it was a good exercise, at least. Every time I had to come back to this project, I get a bellyache almost. So I once had to come back because an author asked me for things about this project, and I realized I don't know what I did there. So this is how my folder looks like. First of all, for example, I don't know why I have a final data and a final database. I really don't know at what point I thought that was a good idea. And when I open final data, I find all this, which is, I mean, to me right now, it's like, I cannot even look at it. I really get the pain because it's like multiple files, a lot of versions of the same script, rather than using version control, or at least taking all the old scripts and putting them in another folder, which is something I do these days when I have like multiple versions. If I'm not using version control for whatever reason, I recommend using version control. It seems that I was pretty explicit about what the files were. So I added a lot of names, which don't make any sense to me anymore. But also something I have encountered later on is that, yes, it's good to add names, but Windows actually has a limit on characters. And at some point, there were some files that were never saved again because Windows could not handle more characters. If you have such long files and then you put them in more folders, at some point it crashes. So maybe something not to do in the future. The code, I really chose the best part of the code. I didn't want to take a screenshot of the part with the analysis, but I can already see that this is for me already very difficult to read, because I like the sections that I'm so used now. I like some comments, even though there are quite a few comments, but some of the things, I mean, it's just simple stuff and I really have to go through it very in detail to understand. I'm using absolute paths, which is something I don't normally recommend these days. I recommend using R projects and use relative paths so that you can just move the folder from one computer to another and increase reproducibility, aiming for that 100%, that is almost never found, and so on. So, I mean, compared to what I do these days, probably it's not perfect, and I'm sure you all have different opinions, but I'm much happier with the code that I do these days. At least it's more readable and I understand it. And I got to have some consistency and I add little changes little by little and getting better with it. You can then work on readmes, make them a little bit more understandable for other people, or even go into R Markdown to write your supplementary materials where you can even like write full paragraphs of text explaining what the code is doing and what you are doing, and writing even the papers there if you would like to. So a lot to improve. It should not be overwhelming, just little by little. And maybe just a commercial break to finish off. We are organizing a reproducibility hackathon for the next SORTI conference. So SORTI is the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. It's going to be a conference from the 11th to the 13th of July. It's worldwide and online, and it's pretty cheap. And if you become a member, which is also pretty cheap, it can be as cheap as $10 for the conference. So there are going to be lots of workshops, lots of hackathons, amazing plenary speakers, and a lot of contributions from many people. So if you want to try to reproduce results from published papers, to really see if having the code helps reproducing results, which is the main question we have with this hackathon, which we did last year already. Feel free to join. We'll be very happy to see you there. And I think it's time to need an apps of code. I think I took too much time. Apologies for that. And I mean, I will share the slides, but here you have some materials on why, more reasons if you want to have more reasons for why you should try to work reproducibly, and that includes neat code. That's it from me. Thanks a lot. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. And if not, I think we can go straight into knitting up some code. Thank you.
Yeah. Annette, if you stop recording now, that would